Good afternoon, everybody. Mary Cheney here. Welcome to the Mike Lead Aspires course, or I'm sorry, sessions. This week we have a special guest from one of our esteemed alum with our Mike Lead Communicators course, and I'm gonna let him introduce himself. But thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for joining us live. Thank you all for joining us on our YouTube channel. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to comment. Please, of course, subscribe and share. That the great content that we have with this area of aspirers. Aspirers, of course, are those that are looking to get into the cybersecurity space. So we want to bring valuable content that will allow you guys to understand, where you are and where you look to go. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Adom Cooper. I'm sorry, Adom Cooper. It's Friday. I'm tired.
Are you
And
sure? Are you sure?
yeah. And I go with my mistakes. So, I'll let you introduce yourself. I'm gonna go off camera and let you get into it. But thank you so much for joining us. And I look forward to your session.
Cool. Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's Friday afternoon. So I'm Adom Cooper. I'm part of the Mike Lead class from June 22 through December 2022. So I just finished a class earlier this year, and I had the privilege of attending the Mike conference just last month. So I got to meet Mary and some other folks in person. So I know there was already talk about a Mike conference for next year. So if you were not in attendance at the Mike Lead conference this past month, definitely sign up for next year so we can meet in person and have more fun. And for all, those of you out there, I did understand that there was going to be a shooting outing and an outing for golfing. So, if that's your interest, keep that in mind. I know ASIL will be happy that I mentioned golf. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about staying curious and sharp. Cybersecurity is everywhere, and you may already be working on it. And so a little background on myself. So again, my name is Adom Cooper. I'm currently based in the Washington, D.C. area. I was actually born here. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. Went to school in Michigan and went to law school at Syracuse. After I graduated from law school, I worked at the UN Population Fund. Then I moved down here to DC to work at a place called the American Society of International Law. And after that, I moved to the US Department of State, where I've been since 2015, and I work in the Bureau of Diplomatic Security. So I work on a lot of things I can't talk about, but there are some cyber direct and indirect things that I've worked on in the past. And so when I heard about the Aspires course and Mary was asking for people to teach and talk about things, I thought to myself, okay, well, I'm not exactly working on cyber, but I think I can talk about kind of how my cyber journey has gone so far, and also how I found out about programs like Mike Lead itself. So I wanted to start with just the basics. So I did just some Googling just to look up, what is cybersecurity itself. So I have a couple of definitions here. So one is from Cisco, one is from IBM, and one's from Microsoft. And I actually will list one from the Department of State in the training module for cybersecurity basics. So there are actually 4. So if you look up Cisco and you ask them what is cybersecurity, their definition is cybersecurity is the practice of protecting systems, networks, and programs from digital attacks. These attacks are usually aimed at accessing, changing, or destroying sensitive information, extorting money from users via ransomware, or interrupting normal business processes. IBM, if you ask them, their definition is cybersecurity is the practice of protecting critical systems and sensitive information from digital attacks, also known as information technology or IT security. Cybersecurity measures are designed to combat threats against network systems and applications, whether those threats originate from inside or outside the organization. And then for Microsoft, if you ask them, their definition is cybersecurity is a set of processes, best practices, and technology solutions that help protect your critical systems and network from digital attacks. As data has proliferated and more people work and connect from anywhere, bad actors have responded by developing sophisticated methods for gaining access to your resources, stealing data, sabotaging your business, or extorting money. Every year, the number of attacks increases, and adversaries develop new methods of evading detection. So you can see that's a mouthful for all 3 of those. And then lastly, from the Department of State, which is where I currently work, and I will add that I am here representing the United States of Adom for this call, not the United States of America or specifically the Department of State. Just had to throw that disclaimer in there. So their definition is cybersecurity is the ability to protect or defend the use of cyberspace from unauthorized accesses or attacks. So when we consider all those three definitions, to me, at the core, cybersecurity is about protecting data and information. It's everything from how you do payroll to how you bring on people to how you protect information when an attack is happening to your everyday business processes. And for individuals, I personally believe that with cybersecurity, defense begins at the desktop, right? I mean, the primary user, if it's phishing email or a social engineering attack, they are the ones who are the most vulnerable, in my opinion, and therefore the ones that are going to be attacked for anything that will happen to the business that is of negative effect. And also, if you're going to deploy any cybersecurity, education or training, your users at the desktop are going to be the ones that are actually implementing this and using it. And so for me, when I think about cybersecurity, it's really an ocean. I know this is the Aspirers course, and we're talking about interests, ways to get into cyber. And so for me, I think of cybersecurity like the ocean, right? And it's kind of like healthcare to me. You could be a physician, you could be a nurse, you could be a surgeon, you could be a hospital administrator, you could be an accountant for the hospital, you could be a resident or an apprentice in training. There's so many options. And I think when we talk about cybersecurity, I know it's become very monetized in today's world, but I think it's also about protecting civil liberties and privacy. I mean, I'm a lawyer by training, even though I'm not currently practicing, but I think a lot about how the Fourth Amendment would apply to some things that are, on the internet and that are in cyberspace. Because when you talk about, searches and seizures, what can be discovered depending on where you are. Cyberspace functions very differently than the physical world. So I think it's important to look at that and think about things you may have touched on. So if you are an aspirer and you're listening to this, I would just encourage you to think about a couple of things. Has there ever been a time when you've touched anything related to data or information? I would certainly hope so. Has there ever been a time where you've been either the lead or experienced conversations where decisions have been made about data or information? And think about for you personally, I'm sure there have been times when you thought about your own data and your own information, how you want to share it. And I'll give a personal example. My wife and I, when we were early in our relationship, we decided to share Google calendars with each other to keep track of our daily lives and how busy we are. And so I will add that I'm the one that ends up checking the calendar more than she does. I know she's not going to watch this, so I can say that. But at the end of the day, that's about granting access controls and permissions to someone else to share your information. I had events on my calendar that I wanted to share with her and vice versa. And also on a deeper level, we were trusting Google to keep our information confidential between the two of us and not going anywhere. I know that there's been a lot of things discussed about data sharing and consumer information, but at the end of the day, we were trusting Google to keep our information just between the two of us. And also, here's another example. I'm sure we've all done this before. Has there ever been a situation where you have hit reply all in an email when you didn't mean to? Well, that could have been a cybersecurity problem because you could have potentially shared data information with folks you didn't mean to. And it could have been personal information. It could have been something that you only meant for a designated or a closed audience, and that went out to everyone. And so it's important to think about those things when we're talking about, cybersecurity and what it touches and what it does not touch. And for historical purposes, I just want to keep in mind for the aspirers here that, when we talk about cybersecurity, it was kind of developed as a military term to denote an attack that is not physical or ordnance in nature. Now, obviously, cybersecurity has changed and it's grown and it's evolved into touching a whole host of things. But at the core, it was really a military term that was used to describe something that was being attacked that wasn't exactly physical, whether it's bullets or bombs or anything like that. So I want you guys to keep those things in mind when you're aspiring to get into cybersecurity. That again, I listed 4 organizations that have 4 very different definitions on how they go about things, and also that cybersecurity, it is really an ocean. There are technical sides of it. There are programmatic sides of it. There are policy sides of it. Policy is where, my work experience itself is where I've kind of had my introduction and what I'm doing now with it. And there are different ways to go about it. So, whether you're currently in school or currently working like me and looking for a pivot, there are a lot of ways to touch into the industry itself, there are a lot of people working on very different things. That's how I ended up meeting Mary through this program, through a mentor of mine that told me about the LEAD program. So there's many ways to get into cybersecurity. And so the headline of my talk is, stay curious and sharp. And so I want to touch a little bit of my personal ethos and how that touches cybersecurity. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about my career progression and certain times when I realize now that I was working on cybersecurity, but at the time I didn't really think anything of it. So for me, I think it's important to have a personal ethos when you're going into any line of work, but I think it's especially important for cybersecurity because the internet is a very big place. There's a lot of, sites, applications, and places where your information can go, where you want to pull information from. So it's important to establish a personal ethos, know why you have it, and then how you're going to implement that throughout your life. So for me, one of my biggest things has always been stay curious about everything. There's a really good scene from, I'm a big fan of Apple TV's Ted Lasso show, and there's a really good scene, I think it's in season 1, where they're in a bar and Ted is throwing darts, and he goes in this whole monologue about, don't be judgmental, stay curious. And that really resonated with me when I watched that, because it speaks to how I try to go about my life and actually how I interact with things in cybersecurity and just, security in general. Don't be judgmental, stay curious. It's important to stay curious about threats and risks. It's important to stay curious about how business processes are currently in place. It's important to question some things too, because that old adage, I currently work for the federal government, so I hear this a lot where it's it's the way we've always done it. Well, that may be a detriment, and things can change, things can evolve, and especially our enemies and our partners are also evolving and changing. So it's incumbent upon us to do that. And when we're talking about staying curious, the more curious you are, in my opinion, that the better you understand what's out there and how it fits together. And I think that applies for the physical world and cyberspace and the digital world. And so for me, I practice this through travel. I love to go see different places. It's kind of one of my non-negotiables. No matter what I'm doing, I'm always trying to go travel to different places, experience new environments. I've had the privilege of actually visiting all 7 continents. I actually checked off Antarctica earlier this year. With that, if anyone's into travel, you feel free to look me up on LinkedIn or on Instagram. We can talk about travel deals and how to find good places to go. Because I think that if more people travel, there'll be a lot less travel with curiosity. There'll be a lot less problems on this planet in general. And so with also being curious, there's also checks and balances I think are key for cybersecurity, including data privacy. So staying curious about 1, why a system or process is in place, 2, who is it affecting, and then 3, what changes need to be made. And of course, if you are of African descent like I am, our community has been really left out of a lot of big policy considerations. So it's also important to take stock of, marginalized and vulnerable populations and how things like artificial intelligence, which have been developed by people who do not look like me, could affect me, whether it's taking my picture or, it's biometrics, scanning my retina and putting me in different places and things like that. So it's important to question, why things are the way they are, and also keep track of checks and balances. And so when you're thinking about getting into cybersecurity, you also need to have a couple of things within your personal ethos, I think, that applies to everybody. So one of those things is be willing to solve problems and be willing to detect future issues and threats. So it's 1, looking at the status quo in the environment, thinking about, all right, what problem can I solve? What are the pain points? What's causing issues? And then also looking a little bit forward and saying, okay, this may not be a problem today, but tomorrow it may be a problem. And like, for example, right now in Washington, D.C., it's raining. And so for cybersecurity, I want to make sure that I bought my umbrella on a sunny day, not a rainy day. Because 1, there may not be any umbrellas on a rainy day, and 2, the cost may go up, and 3, I'm going to be wet while I'm looking for an umbrella. So it's just an example of how you need to stay, 1, willing to solve problems, but 2, also be willing to detect and think about future issues and threats. Also, be teachable and learn for knowledge and understanding. There's always times where you can learn things, whether it's through books or podcasts or going to events. There are a lot of really good cybersecurity just events, whether it's panels or books for things to consume. So it's good to get out there and just see what's out there. And I think that, one of the things that I work on at the State Department is risk management. I think it's important for companies to have a risk management or risk-based ethos in what they're doing, thinking about, okay, how does this decision affect us? If it's business, you're always thinking about what's your bottom line? How is that affected by what's happening? Is that going to affect our staffing, our physical infrastructure, our physical capabilities, our presence domestically and internationally. And also, on top of that, being able to just relate to your fellow person, your fellow human being. I personally like sports and superhero comic book analogies. To me, it makes things very relatable. I told Mary this. I think she's the good version of Thanos. If you're into Avengers, you should know what that means. And also, one thing I'll mention too, and Mary has really drilled this into us, because as I was part of the communicators program, you want to have SMART goals in mind. And SMART's an acronym, so it's specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. So if you're an aspire and you're in school, it's important to think about, all right, what's my plan after I graduate? If you're currently in school, you should be thinking about, okay, what classes do I need to take that might be relevant to where I want to go? What are some skills I want to learn? What are some people that I want to talk to? And then if you're kind of where I am, where you are currently working, but looking for, a pivot, keep holding yourself accountable for, all right, who am I going to network with? What am I going to, who am I going to talk to? Am I going to try and publish some articles on things? Am I going to try and attend talks? Am I going to volunteer to, talk about this at an Aspirers course like I'm doing now? So keeping track of goals for that, because, the journey is the most important thing. You want to make sure that you're picking up, little tidbits for yourself, skills along the way, meeting people, and also just growing yourself, because the more you learn and the more curious you are, I think the better you'll be at doing cybersecurity itself, whether it's on the technical side, the programmatic side, the policy side, whether you're being, a pen tester or you're in charge of a SOC. I think all these things, to me, it's holistic, and it helps you become a better person. And on top of that, being a better, coworker, teammate, or whatever word you want to use. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about my career progression. And I mean, as I mentioned before, I am a trained lawyer. I am barred to practice in Washington, D.C., but I'm not currently using my law degree for my work. So I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, so I grew up in the Midwest. And I remember the day that my parents brought home our first computer. It was a Gateway 2000, I think, was the version of the computer. It had one of those big, huge monitors. And I remember my dad sitting me down a couple of months after we'd been using it, and he had first, talked to me about the importance of using the disk defragmenter and disk cleanup. And I didn't know what that was, but I started to understand how it's important to keep the hard drive clean and getting rid of all the cookies you used. And when I learned about this, I thought I was the biggest deal that I knew about this. I was telling all my friends about it. And I remember the day that my family switched from dial-up to broadband and how much faster our connection was. And I bring that up because I remember the first time that I'd used Google, and it was really kind of a big deal in school. So I'll tell a short anecdote about this. So I believe I was in 6th grade, and we had to do a presentation about presidents. And so our teachers, and this is about access controls and privacy too with this. So teachers had told us, okay, we're going to do a presentation, a report about US presidents. So my classmates and I, we went to www.whitehouse.com. I don't know if that website's still active, but it was an adult entertainment website. And my classmates and I didn't tell anybody about it. We just kept going back to the website every day. And eventually we were corrected by it because, eventually the teachers were paying attention to what we were doing. And I remember that was the first time that I had experienced a website being blocked. And so after that, we were always pointed towards whitehouse.gov. And so this was kind of the first time that I'd experienced, access controls, role-based access, things like that. So on the computers that we were using at the school when I was in 6th grade, this website was blocked. We were not allowed to access it at all. So that really stuck with me, that example, because before that, no one had known about it. So this was a purely reactive thing. And it's my view, especially in the work that I do, a lot of cybersecurity is reactive. I think it's getting better, but especially in government, I see a lot of reaction to things versus being proactive. You're waiting for someone to, not necessarily waiting, but someone visits a site that you don't want them to go to, and then you're going to put measures in place to prevent the next person from going there. And I've always wondered and kind of pushed proactively, well, why don't we look at what's out there that's risk worthy and put measures in place before someone goes to visit that website. So this is kind of an example of how my little journey into cybersecurity kind of started. back when I was in 6th grade. So fast forward to 2008, I'm an undergrad at the University of Michigan, and I traveled to Namibia, which is a country on the continent of Africa. It sits right above South Africa. And I went with this program called World Teach. And it's very similar to the Peace Corps. They send people to, places all around the globe to help with whatever is happening on the ground. And so a little history lesson on Namibia. Namibia split from South Africa in 1990, so the country is still very young. And there was a generation of teachers in Namibia that were not raised as Namibians. They had only been adults as Namibians. They were not raised as Namibians. And when they were working as teachers, their computer proficiency was pretty low. So the Ministry of Education in Namibia passed a law stating that every teacher has to have a certain level of computer proficiency when they are teachers at school. So there was a deadline for all teachers to pass this test to be able to keep being a teacher. So my role when I got to my the school in the village that I was staying in was to teach teachers how to use the internet for the first time. And this was 2008, and there were probably 3 computers in the library itself. And there was culture shock. I mean, I also had wanted to go to the African continent because I'm the first person in my family to travel over there. So there was culture shock, but also there was, resources were a little scarce. I'm dating myself a little bit, but I was able to get a copy of Mavis Beacon, the typing software. I don't even know if it's still around anymore, but that was very helpful for me. But there were a couple of big cybersecurity considerations at the front when I was going to do this teaching. Because one, there's awareness, which I think is very important for cybersecurity, and it's continual education. A lot of the teachers that I had taught, there were probably maybe 22 of them. So let's say there were 11 males and 11 females. None of them had really used the internet before. A couple of them had never even used a computer before. So I had to really start with the basics, and it really kind of forced me to think about, okay, I've always grown up with computers, so I always know how to use it, but how do I actually explain it to somebody else and do so with, empathy and patience? There was a little bit of a language barrier. They all understood English, but I was encouraged to talk very slow because, people from the States tend to talk very fast when they talk in English. And I still am working on that today, as you can probably tell. And on top of that, it's getting folks comfortable with using computers and the internet when no one else is around. So when I was teaching, I had 3 lessons per day with different groups of teachers. And one thing that really struck me was making the teaching relatable. So I had explained to them, okay, you have the computer. It is a physical machine where you can do certain things. Like there was a part of the module when we talk about, making things more efficient and profound for, being able to get things done faster. I had explained to the teachers that instead of for the exams for their students, some teachers would write out the exam. If you have 15 students, some teachers would write out 15 different pieces of paper for their exams. And I've explained to them, look, if you use a computer, you could type it once and print it 15 times. That was really eye-opening for them. But there were also access controls, right? Because you don't want the students coming into the library to use the computer and see the test before it was done. So it's easier to keep a piece of paper private than it is, a file on a computer. And the kids were actually pretty tech savvy. And it was also helping the school itself get its first internet connection. So they use a cable modem with a SIM card to get online. And I had to kind of write up a policy for them on, times to be on the internet. There was, it was a SIM card, so there was data being used. So implementing time limits on it, how many people could be on the internet at once, what the time limits were per week. I was also figuring out, all right, who am I going to appoint in the teachers group to actually check the SIM card after I was gone to replenish it, how the school even pay for it. So I spent my summer doing all of this, and I thought I was just going there to help these people learn how to get on the internet, but I found myself actually helping them write a lot of policies for how the school was going to actually conduct its internet business in general. I mean, I'll bring up another story with this. So when we eventually got the cable modem and the SIM card, there was out of the 22 teachers, there was probably 5 of them that were really, they were very, very sharp, and they were quick about being able to use a computer. So I had helped them get their first email accounts. They were Gmail accounts. And I remember one of the teachers, this was like a Thursday evening, we'll say, we had them all set up. And on Monday morning, I came into the teacher's lounge, and this teacher was going around and he was saying, I'm on the internet now, Bill Gates will email me and I'm important. And I had to kind of pull him to the side and kind of tell him, yes, you're on the internet now and you have an email, but only I actually know your email address. So for now, I am going to be the only one emailing you, and I see you every day. So I had to explain to him, how the internet works with communication. So it's, you meet people, there are certain rules in place, but if you first get a new email account, if no one else knows that you actually have an email, nobody will email you. And I had to kind of teach them about these things and craft the policies and how things could work. And then also the bigger thing was, I was teaching the teachers how to use this, and there was no guarantee that, the next year all the teachers would return to the same school. So from a business standpoint, as I look back on it, I went to the principal and I said, okay, here's things you should implement for the next year, no matter how many teachers you bring back. Here's some things you may not need to worry about. Those were, as I look back on it, those were actually business processes and policies and how the school's library should handle its internet. So that was very formative for me. And that's, as I look back on it, I did a lot that was actually cybersecurity related that I didn't think about at the time. But again, going back to the headline of this, staying curious and sharp, I was using the things that I learned as an undergraduate. I was a communications and political science major, so I was good at communicating things, and I was good at thinking about how policy should work, but I never really drafted anything and implemented it myself. So I was kind of doing both at the same time. These are the kinds of things and opportunities that I think are available in the field of cybersecurity, especially for folks who look like us, because, I've always thought that, people who look like us make the best ambassadors. We make the best negotiators. And I know there is that adage, and I find myself in this quite often, where I'm the only person who looks like me when I walk into a room. Well, when I was at the MiC conference, I think Ozzy Monroe said this, so shout out to him. He said, being the only person in the room, it can be frustrating, but it is also a superpower because you bring a unique perspective. No one thinks like you. And at the end of the day, you can think about solutions multidimensionally when a lot of people around you who don't look like you are probably thinking about it linearly. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about ways that you may get into it as an aspirer, or whether you're, currently in school, looking for work, or if you're just getting into things. There are plenty of places to go to get things like this. So again, I want to stress that getting into cybersecurity, it's not just the technical pieces of it. There are a lot of other programmatic and policy sides of things that, can come into play. So this was 2008. So you fast forward to 2009, I entered Syracuse University to study international law. I knew pretty early on that I didn't want to practice straight up law. In fact, Mary and I were just talking before about having to go to court. That just gives me the shivers. I prefer to be, the only lawyer in the room and working on policy things. But being in law school was very helpful for me because there were two big theories that I learned. The one is learn the difference between the word may versus must. So, permissive versus mandatory. And then also the second thing was looking for enforcement mechanisms. Now in cybersecurity, you can have, just like at the school in Namibia that I was working with, they could have all the policies in the world drafted, but if you don't have something in place to actually enforce it, it's not worth the piece of paper it's written on. It's not worth, the email broadcast or whatever that's put out there. If you don't have resources in place, solutions don't really matter. So it's important to stress with cybersecurity when you're looking at specifically resources on certain things. If someone has a good idea for implementing, I don't know, let's say there's a role-based access tool. And by role-based access, I mean, if you have a program and the program has information files from A to Z, well, not every single person on your team may need to access every file A through Z. Maybe I'll need to access A through L. Maybe someone only needs, M through Z. Role-based access dictates, okay, Adom as his role as, policy analyst, let's say, can access A through L, and M through Z can be accessed by Mary. If there's nothing in place to actually enforce that, the policy itself doesn't really matter. So as you get into cybersecurity, it's important to think about, not only the theories and the policies that are talked about, but always question and wonder about, are there actual enforcement mechanisms, and is there infrastructure and resources to actually keep this going? So when I was in law school, I learned a lot about that because, with the law here, one example I will give is there's probably one thing that's universal that I've seen in the places that I've traveled, and this law needs No explanation. Everyone knows it. It's the traffic light. Everyone knows that red means stop, yellow means slow down, caution, and green means go. No matter where you are, that rule applies. And if you think about the enforcement mechanism, what is it? It's the traffic lights themselves and the intersections. Everybody knows to stop on red and to go green on go and to slow down on yellow. But if there is nothing actually in place to enforce that, whether it's the police writing tickets, or here in DC, there's speed cameras and things like that, it's hard to get people to follow those rules. And there has to be consistent investment in those resources and improvement in some ways. Also, it's not just creating something once and keeping it that way. A lot of what I've seen with cybersecurity, it's also looking at resources to figure out, okay, this is going to work for now, but in the next fiscal year, is this platform still viable? Should we still invest in it? What improvements need to be made? What are the risks and threats to keeping it without improving it, or without growing it? A lot of I believe the term is legacy systems. There are a lot of legacy systems that people use today that, once they are brought into current systems, they should either be, sunsetted, or they require massive upgrades on things. And I kind of looked at the same way with, technology or things that you may buy as an individual consumer. So let's think about, I don't know, a laptop, for example. If your laptop is pretty old, in some cases, it's cheaper and more prudent to go buy a new laptop than it is to actually, put things into it to repair it, like upgrading the RAM, or, getting a new display chip, or whatever the case may be. But the worst thing you could do is nothing. Because if you do nothing, you're leaving yourself up for, and I'm not even talking about being on the internet, but the computer will be slower. It's got a risk of crashing over time. And also, there may be certain applications or programs that you can't get anymore because your system or your motherboard may be too old. Those types of things, they apply for cybersecurity. If your policies and your infrastructure doesn't support, things as they go along with getting modern and making it more secure for things like data privacy, those are risks, and they have to be addressed continually. So those are some things that I learned about when I was in law school. And when I was in law school, I primarily worked on international law, national security, and counterterrorism. And so when you study these three areas, I like to think about, the nexus between all three is that, no matter where you are on earth, there's domestic law that applies, there's international law that will influence, and there's also national security in place. And by national security, I mean the institutional stability and safety of a country's sovereignty, and that can be attacked by other state actors or non-state actors. And by non-state actors, we're talking about groups like, Al Qaeda and ISIS and things like that, versus actual countries that could be, attacking each other. So those are some things that I picked up when I was still in school along the way. So, teaching in Namibia at the Village School and helping them get on the internet for the first time, and then in law school about the two big theories that I mentioned about the may versus must, permissive versus mandatory, and then always looking for enforcement mechanisms. So I really want to stress that, as you're looking to get into cybersecurity, whether it's pursuing certifications or whether it's, networking or trying to get your first job, once you get into a place where cybersecurity is going to have a nexus, it's important to think about, okay, where are the may scenarios, where are the must scenarios, and also what is actually in place to enforce those scenarios. So after I graduated from law school in 2012, because law school is 3 years, I moved to New York City and I started working at this place called the United Nations Population Fund. It's a UN sub-agency, and it focuses on population work. And I worked on child marriage. It was something that I didn't really know much about before I got there, but it was very eye-opening to me. And there are some cybersecurity considerations with this also. So when I was there, we had this exhibit at the UN headquarters, and it's called Too Young to Wed. I would encourage folks to go look that up. It's a big report on how prevalent child marriage rates are, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. And when you look at some of the pictures, you would think that it's a father and a daughter. But then when you read the caption, you quickly realize that it's actually a bride and a groom. And I mean, it's terrible that it exists. I mean, there's not much that we can do about it aside from push pilot programs to keep girls in school as long as possible, and also, incentivize mainly fathers to let their girls go to school because education is important. But I'll bring up a couple of scenarios where there was a cybersecurity nexus to this. So when I was working at the UN, we were publishing a report called Ending Child Marriage. And at the time, the country of Niger had the highest rates of child marriage. And so we wanted to bring over a representative from Niger, a midwife, to come talk about some of these things. Well, culturally in Niger, it is very taboo for a woman to travel either by herself or with a man that is not her husband. And unfortunately, the midwife that we had identified, her husband, for passport travel considerations, could not make the trip. And so we originally were actually not going to be able to bring her over, because when you come to the UN, there are a lot of pictures taken, and there's video and there's press, and we didn't want those things to be published and then someone at her village to find out, and then there could have actually been physical violence taken against her because of this. So we had to be very careful about that. And so to offset this consideration, one of the solutions we came up with was we found a female worker in our UN local office to travel with the midwife to to New York City, accompany her the entire time, and then go back with her. So if there were pictures or videos of the midwife, she was never going to be by herself. So anyone in her village, they were going to look this up online, she was never going to be alone. And also, if people saw her leaving her village and coming back, they would not see her going by herself. Now, obviously, we could not send a male staffer with her, because that would have been a really big problem for her potentially, because if there were pictures or videos of her speaking and things, and someone in her village may have recognized, okay, this isn't your husband, why were you traveling with him instead of your husband? That could have been very dangerous for her. So to me, this is a cybersecurity consideration, because we're talking about privacy and data. It's the privacy of keeping the midwife's, life intact without, messing it up unnecessarily. And also from a data standpoint, recognizing that, hey, if we're going to take pictures and video, they're going to be out there for anyone to consume. So we have to be careful about how we actually disseminate this. So again, I actually did not think about the fact that I was working on cybersecurity at the time, but I actually was, because these were considerations, and we were having conversations about these things to offset the midwife traveling to New York to put this to put some of the events on. So after I left the UN Population Fund, I came to Washington, D.C., where I currently reside. And I started a fellowship at this place called the American Society of International Law. And one of the things that I worked on there was I published a paper in the International Law Association's newsletter about digital privacy in international law. And there were a couple of considerations here with this. The first thing was that I had to figure out, okay, there wasn't really a lot of things being written about digital privacy at the time, because we're talking about, this is in 2014, so these topics were still relatively new. I mean, the Bring Back Our Girls movement was very big when I was working at the American Society of International Law. And so when we talk about digital privacy in international law, I wrote a paper about essentially codifying and looking at, okay, what is on paper for your physical privacy that can be directly applied to your digital privacy? So that's where the first pillar of what I was looking at. The second pillar is what is on the books domestically for your physical privacy that cannot be applied digitally. So that's the second pillar. And then three, what in digital privacy can only exist for digital privacy that would have to be crafted. So for your physical privacy, it's okay, if I want to be intimate with my partner, I have physical privacy in my home. On the internet, I have a reasonable expectation sometimes of privacy when I, choose to write an email, only send it to my mother, for example. I'm not expecting the whole internet to get it. If I reply all to all of my family, then I have made a mistake on with that. But if I intend to only send an email to one person, that's just between the two of us. And then also on top of that, on the internet, if I'm going to, let's say, post something to my Instagram, once I do post that, I am recognizing that this is out there for the entire world to see. I cannot pull it back because the internet is written in ink. So it's thinking about those considerations on top of one, domestic local considerations and international considerations. And I mentioned this because in the previous example about the midwife in Niger, in a lot of places around the world, it's very difficult for especially black and brown folks, black and brown women, to be on the internet and express themselves. I would encourage folks to go look up what's happening with uh, the female revolution in Iran right now. There's been a lot of women get on the internet and talking about things, and they have been hunted on the internet for the things they've posted. People will go after them, and they don't really have any protections digitally from a domestic standpoint. And internationally, they have a little bit, because the Universal Declaration of Human Rights actually does allow some protections for these things. But at the end of the day, you're really at the mercy of the local government. So thinking about macro, different environments, okay, where am I? What am I engaging with on the internet? And how does this affect, my privacy, my security, my data, and the people that I'm sharing it with? And also when I go to consume things, that also. So these are some of the things that I worked on at the American Society of International Law that do have a cybersecurity nexus that at the time I really didn't notice or acknowledge. And then currently, I'm working at the U.S. Department of State in the Bureau of Diplomatic Security. And as you can imagine, because I have a clearance, there are a lot of things I cannot discuss with my work. But I will acknowledge the fact that a lot of my work is risk management based. And when you talk about cybersecurity, how we as the United States defend our embassies, historically, it's always been from physical danger. So you build high walls, you have bulletproof windows and things of that nature. But like the way things have gone, and I mentioned earlier about the difference between a non-state actor and a state actor, attacking at things. It is much easier for a non-state actor to hack into a State Department network than it is to bomb an embassy, right? The barrier of entry is lower. It's much easier to get your hands on a computer than it is, physical ordnance, right? And so when we think about that, risk management, the paradigm has to shift, because if we're deploying countermeasures per se for physical dangers, at what expense of digital dangers are we doing that? If there's only so much money we can spend on defending ourselves, it's important to think about, physical risk versus digital risk. And I'll give a couple of examples with that. So, physically, if you're going to be a foreign service officer at the State Department, and let's say you're going to take your family to, Baghdad, Iraq, it's pretty clear and it's universally known that there are some pretty serious physical dangers of being there at the U.S. Embassy working, for the U.S. Embassy, whether you are either a U.S. citizen or locally employed staff. The physical danger risk is pretty clear, but the digital risk and the digital dangers, they're a little murky, right? And I'll mention another place. So this is a pretty easy example, but I think it's easy to understand. If you are a foreign service officer going to serve in Beijing, China, it's pretty universally well known in the same point that the physical risk of danger is probably pretty low. It's, I've been to Beijing myself. It's pretty safe to walk around. But digitally, the risks are through the roof. I mean, you could be hacked and followed. I actually was talking to a coworker of mine, and this is a story that he told me, so I don't know if this is 100% true, but I will share it anyway. He mentioned to me that a colleague of his who is of Chinese descent said that when he was in China with his cell phone, he had jaywalked. And before he crossed the street, there was a ticket waiting for him in his email. That's mind-blowing to me. That means that there was, algorithms and programs and people watching, tracking your movement to know that, okay, you are on a street, but you don't have the right of way, you are crossing it, and then because of that, you are violating a law, and now you're going to get a citation. That blows my mind, because somewhere like Baghdad, Iraq, I would guess that those types of things are not in place. So these are the kinds of cybersecurity considerations that I've experienced, thinking about the difference between physical risk and digital risk, and then going back to the top, thinking about, okay, what resources are in place to actually support this? Is it a may versus a must? And then also on top of that, are there actually resources and infrastructure in place to implement this now and maintain it going forward? Very recently, last calendar year in 2022, the State Department, they implemented a way to, and this was, I think, part of the president's executive orders on cybersecurity. We shifted from, single sign-on to MFA. So, you have multi-factor authentication to sign in. They had that rule put down. They had it drafted on paper and they would disseminate to everybody. But from resources, they also had to disseminate things like key card videos for everybody, because a lot of people are teleworking now, include myself. I telework a couple days a week. the resources had to be there. And then also from an enforcement standpoint, they had to have, IT staff folks to actually write the code in a certain way. So if you tried to sign on without MFA, they wouldn't let you get in. They may have had to hire more folks, dedicate more money to that. And that's perpetual, because now from where I'm sitting, MFA is with us forever, and we're never going back with that. So I think that's important to keep in mind, that there are a lot of things you could be working on with cybersecurity as an inspirer. I think there are so many things that you could be getting into it, but this is how kind of I've experienced cybersecurity in my career so far. And so currently, and I became a member of the MiC Lead program, as I mentioned before, with the 2022 June to December cohort. I'm looking to do a pivot to a role that specifically focuses on cybersecurity, mainly in the policy realm or trust and safety, because that's kind of my wheelhouse of what I've been working on. But there are plenty of other ways. When I was at the MiC Lead conference, I learned a lot about pen testing. It sounds interesting to me, and I'm actually going to try getting into it a little bit. So for me, it's important to stress that, there may be one area that you may want to get into, but there also are other areas that you could find out and learn about and also pursue. So in addition to my job search, I'm also working on a children's book about cybersecurity. It's called Rhino Ram. I have a character concept going. I've developed some curriculum as well. And I've used this to do three things. One, strengthen my own knowledge about cybersecurity awareness, because I did a peer review. There are not a lot of good resources out there for K through 12 on cybersecurity in general. We're talking about just teaching kids about what is the internet, what are the dangers of it, what is cybersecurity, why are passwords important, what is multi-factor authentication, just these basic things, so they have a foundation. So when they do go into the workforce, they are starting from scratch. So I've been working on that with my local DC public school to do some curriculum, and that's really strengthened my knowledge on some things, because I'm finding as I share my concept, like with folks like Mary, I get put in touch with more people, and I can learn about things that I may not have thought about that need to be in the curriculum. So I think it's important to, like I mentioned at the top, stay curious about things, but also stay sharp. And the sharp part of this for me is, as I'm drafting this curriculum, I'm thinking about, okay, what do I wish that I had in second grade with cybersecurity? So I'm drafting the curriculum in that manner. So that's my career progression so far. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about transferable skills. I know Mary's come back on video. Do you have any questions or anything? Should I stop for a second?
No, I was just no. You're fine. I thought you were closing out. We have 10 minutes up, but no, you don't have to. Keep going. I'm gonna go back off.
Sure. Yeah. So I just have one more bit about transferable skills. So I want to stress that, for me, I currently don't have any cybersecurity certifications. I don't really consider myself, a tech person, even though I do consider myself tech savvy, but I don't really consider myself a tech person. I'm not writing code, I'm not doing anything like that. But you can work on these things, these transferable skills that I'm going to list, no matter where you are, what you're currently working on. So at the top, it's knowing how to brief well. So it's knowing what information needs to be presented and then actually relaying it to your audience. So knowing how to brief well. Working at the State Department, I've had to do quite a few briefings myself. And the second thing of that is just knowing how to present. And it's also, for me, and I'm happy to disclose the fact that when I was younger, I used to have a terrible stutter, and I went to speech pathology class to help work on it. And I used to be afraid to public speak, but now I kind of seek out these opportunities to kind of keep working on it. So at the MiC conference, I was kind of voluntold by Mary that I was going to be talking. So I did that, and then I volunteered for this. So I think it's being comfortable presenting in different ways and means, because you're always going to be having to relay information. And the other end of that is the third thing I'll mention is being able to write well, because there are times when you're not going to be able to actually speak to someone. You're going to need to be able to convey something, whether it's an email or from a memo or an actual report. You have to be able to convey information via text, and you have to be able to do that well, depending on what the audience is. The next thing I'll mention is being able to stay very organized. It saves you a lot of time. I know some people have really clustered desktops and it works for them and things like that. But, being able to stay organized, because when you're given, a project or, you're given a team to go run or something like that, you kind of want to already have the bare bones of how you're going to go about doing it based on how you're organized as an individual. So it's okay. I have, an outline. Here's how we're going to do things. Keep it flexible, but it's important to have, a bare bones thing on ready to go with that. Also, being able to advocate and lobby for an idea, proposal, or solution. So this is where my legal training comes in very well. Being able to pick a viewpoint and give examples and evidence on why it should happen. Being able to think about. I'm always thinking about, okay, if I want to present, option A, I like to think backwards. So I'm thinking to myself, all right, who in this room is going to be the biggest naysayer, and what topic or thing are they going to point to shoot my ID down? And I try and craft my solution around that. So getting in the practice of doing that, I think that's really important. And the other end of that is knowing when to pick your battles. Sometimes it's important to really double down on something that you think is going to work. Other times it's better just to back off because it's not worth your time or your stress. So that's the end of what I wanted to cover today. I hope this was helpful in some realm. I don't know if there are any questions or anything, but that's the end of what I wanted to cover today. So Mary, please tell me if there are any questions or anything.
No, I didn't have any questions. Great job. I was just, there was a couple of things out there that you said that I want you guys to know just for my own, for your own knowledge. Email is never secure unless it's an encrypted email. So please don't think. And there was a privacy issue with my son in the school. That a story that I tell about that, but that's a longer story. We don't really have time for that. But just know that Google, if you actually look at Google and you look into your settings and see just how much information is being tracked, and just like literally everything that you're doing, and even YouTube and the connections and all, it keeps everything. So hygiene is important as well, as far as cleaning up a lot of the stuff that you may be doing. But one of the other things that I have that I want to share with you guys that are here that may be listening, coming up in May will be we have our MiC Talent Solutions, which is our for-profit arm. And we have an apprenticeship program that's going to go live, and that's going to be. We have been approved. It's just not been announced yet. I've been working on the press release as well. So for those of you that are out there as aspirers that want to start someplace, we now have a place for you guys to go and a place for you guys to start your journey. There are about 7 different roles that we're going to be, that someone can pick, and pen tester is one of them actually. 7 different roles that someone can pick to be able to start their cybersecurity career journey, and it's meant for the aspirers. It's also meant for those that are transitioning. It's also meant for those that may be in one area, in the legal and privacy space, but want to get into it, in the cybersecurity or legal privacy space, and want to get into something else. So this fits with your career path as well, Adom. It's just a matter of being able to provide a path and a roadmap for someone that wants to be in this profession. And it's coming. I've been waiting. But Adom and I both know how fast the federal government works. So, and I was just going to leave it.
Fast? No. Well, I will say this: the caveat is when something bad happens, they are lightning fast. But when everything is great and the sky is blue and it's just sunshine and butterflies, it's just molasses.
Yeah, no, I've been waiting on this approval now for a couple of months, and it finally came through, but I'm still waiting on when I can officially announce it, and I'm officially announcing it. So we're going to be holding information sessions about the apprenticeship program on May 15th. As well as June 5th. And it's going to be taking over some of the other programming that we do here at Minorities in Cybersecurity, just to be able to let you guys ask questions and see where to start and where that process starts. So I look forward to working with you all to try to now establish and grow from an aspirer all the way through, to a builder, to a communicator, and then all the way to a director, and hopefully boards of directors, because that's what we're doing here. That's what we're trying to create, that pathway. So I didn't see any other questions out there. I want to thank you, Adom, for sharing your journey. I think it's very important for individuals to know that there are so many different avenues and so many different ways that you can become a part of cybersecurity, and don't feel like you have to take the highly super technical route. It's just not necessarily required. So for that, just knowing your story and hearing your story, it was fascinating to me, even though I've heard bits and pieces of it before. I've never really heard you explain it just from beginning to end, but it is fascinating, and I'm here for you. I'm here for everybody to be able to transition and pivot into the areas of cybersecurity that they enjoy doing. So I appreciate your time, and we're going to give everybody back their Friday evening. Hopefully you guys have a wonderful and a great weekend, and we'll talk to you guys again coming up next time. Okay, I think that would be, what is this? I think that'll be May 12th is our next session, and that's going to be another session with AWS, and they'll be bringing the AWS team to Mike Aspires to have a chat with you guys. So all that to be